When I'm done here, I'm going to a Western evening. And so I'm getting all dressed up in the cowboy shirt and all those other things. And I thought it'd be a great illustration, actually, because so much of our conversation about missional theology is actually about culture. It's about cultural appropriation. It's often about the way in which we have violated people's culture and imposed culture upon people. And part of it is also about inculturation, the extent to which we can find out what is appropriate culturally to the context we're in. So one of the conversations I think within missional theology actually dates within missions, a conversation around missions and church history. And so I've chosen two incidents to pick up on just as an illustration of that. So if we could have the second slide, I think it is, David. You can pop those up, that'd be great. Next one. All right. So John Colenso was the Bishop of Natal, and he got somewhat up the nose of the church by suggesting that actually God was already present in Africa way before missionaries got there, and that mission was just simply joining the action of God. That may sound familiar to some of you who have been trained in missional theology. He also argued, which I think got up people's noses even further, was that ultimately African culture was probably closer to biblical culture than European culture was. That obviously offended British imperialists no end. Next slide, please. And his basic theological assumption was the universal God is universally active. Yahweh is present in all places. That's a Hebrew concept. And that sharing the story of Jesus and the kingdom of God are actually about joining God's existing activity in people's lives. Next slide, please. The second key point for me was around the Edinburgh Conference of 1910. Sorry, that should read 1910, not 1010. That would take us back to the Battle of Hastings and so on. But in 1910, there was a conference in Edinburgh on mission, and there were two key characters in that conference, for me at any rate. One was John Mott, who was a Methodist. He argued for the indigenization of evangelism around the world. And the other one was the only Asian representative at the entire conference. Thousands of folk were there, Cheng Yin Yi, and he argued that in actual fact, the church needed to sort of scrap these colonial structures and begin to indigenize itself around indigenous leadership. What that did, by the way, in the South African context, was the formation of the Ethiopian Church in South Africa, which is basically Methodists and Anglicans who went independent of the colonial church, and also the formation of Zionist churches. Zionist churches were a formation in South Africa of churches with a Pentecostal root within them, and they were later accused of syncretism and taking the faith too far. But what they were trying to do was indigenize Pentecostalism in their own context. Next slide, please. And part of the issue in the 1910 conference was the idea of coming from an era of non-contextualization, where we failed to recognize that we had dressed the gospel up in culture and we were just simply imposing that culture on people, not necessarily recognizing the cultural lens through which we saw things. So I can wear this hat if you want me to. I can wear this hat if you want me to, or I can even wear this hat if you want me to. But I'm still, in a sense, translating the same cultural framework. I'm just changing the color. And so part of the issue for us in missional theology is the extent to which we're really involved in window dressing. And part of our difficulty is working out that we can't actually differentiate the gospel from culture. We have to read scripture in context. It's contained in culture. But when we communicate faith, we always communicate faith in culture. Faith is something we inherit from others. They share it with us within a cultural framework. And the question really is the extent to which we make ourselves vulnerable enough to let people live out the faith for themselves. And that becomes the key issue for me, is in a missional theology, how do we, in a sense, give ourselves the space to become vulnerable enough to say, hey, this doesn't make sense in the way that I've put it together. This doesn't make sense to the people who are receiving it. And maybe they're uncomfortable with the hats that we expect them to wear. And maybe we need to somehow or other reframe the conversation, give people the space to, in a sense, indigenize culture. Next slide. Thanks, David. Next slide. We'll go from there, actually. I'm aware of time. So what I came up with about 5 years ago, the Diocese of Toronto asked me to do a sort of a review of regional ministry. And there were a couple of things that came out for me that were really key. And so I want to explore those because all of them have to really do with how we understand the extent to which we indigenize culture and indigenize faith within a local context. And that may sound strange to you considering the context I'm working in. I'm working in Barrie, which is a small Ontario town with two churches. One is an urban church, the other one is a suburban church, and 4 rural points, which are really on the outskirts of Barrie. And you might think, well, they're not that different from each other, but actually they are. Next slide. So the first premise that we had was, how do we sustain a ministry of presence, a being with or an empathic presence in each community where we've had a ministry? As the church has reduced its numbers, the question is, what are we really doing there? And for me, the ministry of presence is actually the primary issue that we're dealing with. It's the primary way in which we communicate the gospel, the sense of being with others as God is with us, as Christ incarnates himself. That incarnational theology actually becomes central when we talk about culture, because the being with piece recognizes the lens that I see things through and how different the lens I see things through might be to yours. And so one of our primary objectives is to say, if we re-looked at our churches and we re-looked at the sense of why we're there, what is it that's primary to the way we do it? And the ministry of presence for me, as somebody more from an Anglo-Catholic perspective, becomes really key. So much of our life as church is doing things rather than being with people and incarnating faith in some really tangible way. Next slide, please, David. So for me, the key piece is contextual approach. One size does not fit all. That's our difficulty. We have repeated the same model over and over again. I jokingly say that by and large, we have one church, one priest model, and that's how we have functioned in most of the contexts we've worked in. But maybe we need to think about a multiplicities of possibilities, that we need to encourage a sense of buy-in and local input into what is appropriate in the context in which we're working in, and that one size fits all model is inadequate for that intended purpose. Next slide, please, David. Picking up from Archbishop Rowan Williams, that maybe we need to look at hybrid or mixed economy church as an approach. A colleague of mine in anthropology, Muggsy Spiegel, coined the phrase polyvocality in anthropology, the idea that there are multiple voices that we need to be attentive to. And our voice is only one of many. And so when we're in a parish context or in a local context of ministry, maybe the learning to listen piece is learning to listen to the multiple voices, not the single voices. And in listening to those multiple voices, maybe the forms of church that we want to look at is not a single lens, but multiple lenses. That the sense of maybe finding ways of being church in any given place actually has multiple expressions to it, not a single expression. And as much as I appreciate the Anglican lens and the umbrella in which I work through, and that is what I want to sustain, it's a voice within the multiplicity of possibilities within the context that I work. Next slide, please, David. The other piece for me was learning that vision is first, that we need to be able to sense where things are going. So here at Trinity, for example, where I'm sitting at the moment, we went on a 2-year process of envisioning where we literally listened to our community and listened to ourselves. We explored community partnerships with a whole bunch of different agencies and invited them in to have conversations with us about how we could find out our place as an urbanized church in a place with mass gentrification, with condos going up all over the show, but profound social need. We're in the highest density of social need in the city of Barrie, here at Trinity, and St. Margaret's is in the second center of social need. Homelessness is rife. food insecurity is a big issue for us, people's access to basic healthcare, all those bits and pieces. And so we've begun to formulate ministry around those needs, but in partnership with others by listening to them and inviting them into our space and to work with us. Next slide, please, David. And what I began to realize, the more folk I began to interview, is that by and large, one of the issues they suffer is a lack of investment from the organizational system. And so often, given funding for 2 years or given a little window of opportunity to invent something and make it sellable to the diocese or whatever it is that they're doing, but the difficulty with doing missional work, just like church planting, you have to have a long-term vision of what's possible. And that long-term vision also needs to have a succession plan involved in it. You need to think about who's taking on the project when you're done, sort of conversations. How unique is this project to you and the lens that you bring to it versus is this, transferable to somebody else? All those bits and pieces, but that requires a lot of investment from the diocese or the organizations that we're working in to say, hey, we have a long-term sustainable view of what you're doing, and we want to invest ourselves in that. Part of our difficulty over and over again in our system historically has been that we've asset stripped ministry in local places. We shut a parish down and the resources, if they're not allocated to somebody else, go back to the diocese to fund ministry. I get that piece. But in some levels, we then lose the investment locally. I'm very thankful in this diocese that when we formed an amalgamation with one of our neighboring churches, we got an incredible return back on that investment as a parish of St. Margaret's. And so we formed a relationship with a parish called St. Giles, and the ministry that they were doing, we have sustained. We've sustained their geographic presence. We've sustained the chaplaincy in the hospital, for example, and nursing homes that are involved in those sorts of things. But we're fortunate that we're in a place where our diocese does see that long-term investment is necessary. And for that, I'm thankful. But for those of us who are doing regional ministry, one of the questions we need to ask is, how do we make sure that we don't asset strip the system in actual fact, and then undermine the sustainability of the project in the long term? And then last slide, please, David. I think it should be the last slide. So if you look at us, actually, it's not the last slide. So if you look at us, Trinity is the little blue dot in the downtown core. St. Margaret's is a suburban parish. We have the parish of St. Paul's in Midhurst, which is a suburban small town parish. St. John's Craighurst, which is a small town parish, and these two parishes down in the south here in North Essa, Ivy and Utopia, and again, they're both historical parishes. But when you look at them in a listening process, you begin to realize how different they are. St. Margaret's was planted in the 1980s. On the back of a whole lot of new folk who came from Toronto and settled in the city of Barrie because housing here was affordable. They have been replaced by younger families who've now moved in because those folks are now retiring who originally came here in the 80s to plant Little St. Margaret's and build a sanctuary and so on. The parish of Trinity, Barrie, is 190 years old this year. It is the moneyed parish. It was the money parish. It isn't anymore. It was the moneyed parish of the city of Barrie, and it was stacked with lawyers and doctors and professionals and undertakers and all sorts of anybody who has a name in Barrie is somehow associated with Trinity Barrie. But it went through a significant split in the 80s and some significant decline. And as we've tried to reinvent it, we've had to take that history and that anticipation into account. And these smaller rural places are all in places that are potentially dormitory towns for Barrie and the GTA. And so folk commute out of these communities to go to other places. And the new people who live there are not rural people primarily. They're now urbanites. They're suburban culture people. And so understanding the dynamic of who they are changes what we do. Next slide, please. Actually, we can go one more beyond that one. Okay. So just to give you some examples of what we've done, Andrew Vaughan is on this call with us at the moment. He is the priest in charge of Midhurst Craighurst, and he launched Hiking Church. Hiking Church meets on a Saturday once a month, and it's in a community of people people move up to Barrie because they want to be outdoors, they want to enjoy the outdoor life, they want to connect up to nature, all those things. And so Andrew has built a hiking church model, inviting people into a liturgical space within the zillions of forests that we have up here, and all the outdoors and everything that offers them. And again, it's asking, what's the context? What's the culture? How do we enter into it? How do we listen to people? How do we engage ourselves? What is the bias that we bring into the system, and how does that shape what we do? At Trinity, we've entered a whole lot of community partnerships, primarily around the care of the poor. And we've coined the phrase ourselves being a kitchen church. And we do, everything we do revolves around feeding people and so on. And we've done numbers of different experiments over the last 3 years that I've been here around food and food scarcity and those things, from pantry boxes outside, to running cooking classes, to all sorts of different little bits and pieces around food. We have spaghetti dinners once a month and so on. And our primary emphasis is to say that's who we are, that's the community of need we are in, and how do we begin to articulate who we are with the folk that are around us. We've now also formed a partnership with Compassionate Care. We run a clinic here at Trinity, four mornings a week, with nurse practitioners and a doctor 1 day a week who volunteer their time to care for those who are homeless and insecure. But we don't have a local clinic, health clinic in our neighborhood, and so we provide that service through our partnership with Compassionate Care. St. Margaret's is a new suburban church, and one of the issues we've dealt with is how do we create community in this pandemic of loneliness? And as we've engaged ourselves more and more in the post-pandemic conversation, we've recognized that people in a suburban context can feel incredibly isolated. Many of them are new suburbanites who've moved into our context and find, that they just lack a connection. And so we've seen the church as a primary point of contact for that connection, whether that's me offering free ukulele and guitar lessons on a Wednesday, to us running retirees groups now once a month and so on. But again, it's those sorts of senses of engaging ourselves authentically with our local context and saying, hey, how is the gospel enculturated by us, but how do we translate it into the context that we find ourselves in that is peculiar and particular to our time? But thank you very much indeed for allowing me on. Do appreciate that a great deal. And thank you for a really good conversation. Thank you.